The case of a missing pregnant woman, her husband, a respected pastor, the prime suspect. What could lead a man of God to murder his wife? June 14, 2023. Chesterfield, a quiet Virginia town with tree-lined streets and a strong sense of community, woke up to devastating news. 32-year-old MIA Thompson, 7 months pregnant and the wife of Pastor Darius Thompson, had vanished overnight. What started as a frantic search for a missing woman quickly spiraled into a nightmare no one could have anticipated. MIA was known and loved by everyone in her community. To her congregation at Living Grace Fellowship, she was a beacon of kindness, always the first to lend a helping hand. Her marriage to Darius, a charismatic and respected pastor, was often held up as a model of love and faith. But behind the closed doors of their home on Willow Crest Drive, everything was far from what it seemed. It was Darius who called the police. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he explained that MIA had gone to bed early the night before and was missing when he woke up. The house was undisturbed, no signs of a break-in, no struggle, no note. But as officers arrived on the scene, something felt off. In the bedroom, faint stains dotted the pale cream carpet near the bedside table. At first glance, they seemed insignificant, but under the harsh glare of forensic lights, they told a different story. The investigation began almost immediately. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to neighbors who described MIA as kind, caring, and devoted to her faith. They said MIA was excited about the baby, her miracle child after years of struggling to conceive. No one could fathom why she would leave without a word. And yet, there were whispers. Whispers that perhaps the marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Whispers that Pastor Darius had been distant in recent months, his once steady presence in the community now marked by late nights and unexplained absences. What was Darius hiding? And why did the faint blood stains lead detectives to suspect something more sinister had happened in the very room he shared with his wife? Before we dive into this gripping story, we want to take a moment to thank you for joining us. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an intense life story like this one. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to life. Now, let's begin. What unfolds in this chilling tale might just surprise you. As the hours turned into days, the case became more troubling. Detectives uncovered a chilling clue, a text message sent from Darius's phone to an unknown number the night MIA disappeared. It read, "It's done. No turning back now." Who had he sent this message to? And what was it that had been done? June 15, 2023, the search intensified. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property, their handlers meticulously combing the wooded area behind the Thompson home. The church community, initially rallying in support of their beloved pastor, began to question everything. How could the man who preached forgiveness and love every Sunday morning possibly be connected to his wife's disappearance? Investigators began piecing together a timeline. Darius claimed he had been at the church office the previous evening, preparing for Sunday's sermon. He said MIA had complained of feeling unwell and retired to bed early. But phone records painted a different picture. At 10:45 p.m., while MIA was supposedly asleep, Darius had made a 15-minute call to a number registered to Camille Harper, a wealthy local businesswoman and close family friend. Camille, who had been a frequent guest at church functions and had often dined with the Thompsons, was now a person of interest. What was her connection to Mia's disappearance? As investigators questioned Camille, her demeanor was cool, calculated. She denied any involvement, insisting she had spoken to Darius only about church fundraising. But her words raised more questions than answers. Why was her number the last Darius called before his wife vanished? What role had she played in the Thompsons' lives? And could she have been more involved than she let on? Then came the breakthrough. On June 16, 2023, forensic results from the blood stains in the bedroom came back. They were confirmed to be Mia's. The stains were small but significant, suggesting an injury rather than an accident. For the first time, the case shifted from a missing person investigation to a potential homicide. The walls were closing in on Darius. With every passing hour, the evidence mounted. His alibi began to crumble under scrutiny. Church security cameras revealed he had left his office at 9:30 p.m. and didn't return until after midnight. Where had he been during those critical hours? What was he hiding? As the investigation deepened, so did the moral dilemma. What drives a man, entrusted with the spiritual guidance of hundreds, to betray not only his wife but his community. What secrets lay hidden in the mind of a man who could stand before his congregation and preach about the sanctity of marriage while harboring a deadly secret? And then came the most damning discovery: a small vial of liquid hidden in a drawer in the pastor's study. Toxicology tests confirmed it contained a lethal poison. It was the same substance that would later be found in Mia's system during her autopsy. The evidence was clear, but the motive remained elusive. Why would Darius, a man of faith, commit such an act? What had happened in the final hours before Mia's disappearance that pushed him to the brink? The answers to these questions would shake the foundation of everything the community believed. But as investigators would soon discover, the truth was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. The sun had barely risen over Chesterfield, Virginia, on a crisp autumn morning, September 15, 2023, when the cracks in Darius Thompson's life began to show. At the pulpit of Living Grace Fellowship Church, he stood tall, his deep voice resonating through the sanctuary, delivering his Sunday sermon. His words were powerful, inspiring. Congregants nodded in agreement, their faces bright with admiration for a pastor they trusted with their deepest concerns. Darius Thompson was their beacon of hope. To them, he was a man above reproach, a man of God who had dedicated his life to serving others. But behind the comfort of his public life, something darker was starting to unfold. As Darius finished his sermon that morning, a faint but noticeable tension in his shoulders betrayed the calm facade. When he stepped off the stage, he didn't head to greet his parishioners as he usually did. Instead, he retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. A place where he could take a moment to gather his thoughts, or so he told himself. But there was more at play, an unspoken secret growing between him and someone far outside the reach of the church's sacred walls. Mia Thompson, Darius's wife, sat in the front row of the church, as she always did. A graceful woman in her early 30s, Mia was everything that Darius had promised to cherish: loving, devoted, and unwavering in her faith. She had been a part of the church community for years, a volunteer in the youth ministry, a counselor to troubled families, a friend to anyone who needed her. Her warmth was her defining trait, but even she could not ignore the emptiness that had begun to linger between her and Darius. For years, Mia had dreamed of becoming a mother. She and Darius had tried for what felt like an eternity to conceive, but every attempt ended in disappointment. But that day, March 22, 2023, to be exact, was different. After what felt like a lifetime of hope and heartache, Mia discovered she was pregnant. The doctor had confirmed it earlier that afternoon, and she could hardly contain her joy. She immediately went to the church, bursting with excitement. But when she arrived at the sanctuary, the last thing she expected was the cold silence that greeted her. Darius had already left for his office, barely acknowledging her presence as he passed her by, lost in his own world. It was on that very day, in the midst of Mia's overwhelming joy, that Darius's focus had begun to drift. The long, lonely nights that followed became a fixture in their marriage. He would often leave after dinner, saying he had more work to do at church, or worse, spending long hours in the office with Camille Harper, a wealthy woman from the congregation. Camille was glamorous, polished, and well known in the community for her charity work. She was a woman who seemed to have it all: wealth, beauty, and influence. She also had something else, something Mia could never have imagined. For months, Darius had been having an affair with Camille, his emotional neglect towards Mia only deepening their bond. Mia, for all her devotion, remained blissfully unaware of the affair. She clung to the hope that their marriage, now infused with the joy of pregnancy, would be the thing to repair the distance between her and Darius. But each day, the wedge between them widened. Darius's growing absences, the quiet dismissals, the late-night phone calls, Mia dismissed them all. She convinced herself that he was simply overwhelmed with the pressures of his dual life, as a pastor and a husband. But on the evening of April 3, 2023, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was just after dinner when Darius had slipped out of the house, murmuring something about finishing up at the church. But Mia knew better this time. She watched him drive away, his car disappearing into the darkness of the night, her heart heavy with an unfamiliar feeling. Was he truly at the church, or was he somewhere else? At this point, Camille's role in their lives had begun to grow. Mia trusted her. After all, Camille was a constant presence in church activities, a friend to both of them. But she had no idea that Camille's kindness hid a far more dangerous intent. Camille, a woman with a taste for power and control, had seen an opportunity in Darius. She was the one who comforted him when he was overwhelmed with guilt, the one who filled the emotional void that MIA, in her vulnerability, could no longer reach. They met secretly at least twice a week, their rendezvous carefully concealed from everyone, including the unsuspecting MIA. By the time June 10, 2023, arrived, Mia's suspicions had reached a breaking point. She had noticed the change in Darius's behavior. It wasn't just the late nights or the distant conversations. It was the coldness that had settled between them. But still, MIA held out hope. She was pregnant with their first child, and surely, Darius would come back to her. Surely, their love would endure. What MIA didn't know was that by then, Darius had already made his choice. Camille had become more than a confidant. She had become his escape. As the affair grew more intense, the emotional ties Darius had to MIA began to loosen. What was once a deep and abiding love had slowly transformed into something more transactional, built on secrecy and deceit. But why did Darius drift so far from MIA? Was it the pressures of marriage, the constant strain of his role as a pastor, or was something more sinister at play, something that would push him to a breaking point, to a place where the unthinkable could happen? And Camille? What did she truly want? Was she simply in love with Darius? Or was there something more? Was it the power he held, the position he had in the church, or something darker that had drawn her to him? As the days grew warmer, and Mia's due date approached, the tension between Darius, MIA, and Camille continued to grow. The cracks in the marriage deepened, and soon, the consequences of Darius's choices would take a devastating toll, setting in motion a tragedy that would forever change the lives of those involved. The warmth of the spring months brought with it a biting tension that seemed to settle within the walls of the Thompson household. It was the evening of May 8, 2023, a Tuesday, when MIA sat alone in the kitchen, rubbing her swollen belly, eyes glued to the clock on the wall. The hours dragged on, each tick a painful reminder of the distance that had crept into her marriage. Darius had been home only a few times in the past week. Each time, he'd come and gone, offering only the briefest of smiles before retreating back to his world, leaving MIA to manage her high-risk pregnancy on her own. Her emotions were all over the place, elation mixed with fear, joy coupled with frustration. Her body ached from the weight of the pregnancy, and her heart ached from the weight of her husband's indifference. With each passing day, it became more and more difficult for her to ignore the obvious cracks forming in their relationship. Darius, once so attentive, had become increasingly distant. The late nights at the church had become routine, as had the unexplained absences. He would leave without saying where he was going or when he'd be back. And yet when he returned, he was always vague, offering no explanations, only weak reassurances that everything was fine. On that particular night, the tension was thick. MIA had gone to bed earlier, but the exhaustion of her pregnancy made it impossible to sleep. She tossed and turned in their bed, the silence between them more suffocating than the weight of her growing belly. The rhythmic sound of Darius's breathing beside her should have been comforting, but it only made the gap between them feel wider. She could feel it in the way he seemed to have withdrawn into himself, the way his eyes, once filled with love, now held something else, something she couldn't name. Maybe it's just the pregnancy, she told herself. Maybe he's just tired. But even as she tried to convince herself, she knew there was more to it. The strain had been building for weeks, months even. She had felt it in his touch, distant, mechanical, as if he were going through the motions rather than engaging with her. The whispered conversations late at night, the strange glances he'd exchanged with Camille at church. These moments had begun to take root in her mind, festering into something she couldn't ignore. But what could she do? She had tried to talk to him, to bridge the gap, but Darius had brushed off her concerns with carefully chosen words that felt too rehearsed, too practiced to be sincere. It was on May 11, 2023, that MIA finally confronted him. He had returned late from the church again, smelling faintly of cologne, but not his usual scent. His eyes were dull, and when he saw her standing by the front door, arms crossed, waiting for him, he froze for a moment. "Where have you been?" MIA asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and fear. Just finishing up some work, Darius replied, his voice casual, too casual. But MIA saw through the lie. She had known him long enough to know when something wasn't right. You've been working late every night this week, she pressed, her eyes searching his face for any sign of remorse. I need you, Darius. I need you here with me. This pregnancy isn't easy, and I'm scared. I can't do this alone. Darius sighed, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch cold and distant. I know, MIA. I know, and I'm sorry. I've just been under a lot of pressure lately. But I'm here now. Let's talk about it. His words were like a balm, soothing the pain she had been carrying. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that their love could withstand whatever was pulling them apart. But deep down, MIA knew that something was off. This wasn't just about late nights at the office. There was something else, something he wasn't telling her. Over the next few days, Darius tried to win her back, lavishing her with affection he had long since stopped showing. He showered her with flowers, took her to dinner, even attended her doctor's appointments, pretending to care about the pregnancy and her well-being. He apologized for his behavior, promising that things would change. But even as he said the words, MIA could see the cracks in his facade. There was a coldness behind his eyes, a reluctance to engage in the intimacy they once shared. She could feel the manipulation beneath the surface. Darius wasn't just trying to patch things up, he was trying to keep her from discovering the truth. He needed to maintain control of the situation, to keep MIA from finding out what he had been hiding. Camille had become more than just a brief affair. She had become his escape, his secret life. The affair had deepened, and with it, Darius's fear of exposure grew. He couldn't afford for MIA to find out. He couldn't risk losing everything. His reputation, his position in the church, his access to Camille's wealth. So, he played his part. He gave MIA just enough attention to quell her suspicions, all the while distancing himself further. By May 20th, 2023, the tension in the Thompson household was unbearable. MIA was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She couldn't keep up the act any longer. Her body, already stretched thin from the pregnancy, was breaking under the strain. She began to suspect that the coldness wasn't just Darius's growing indifference. It was something far darker. His behavior wasn't just the result of stress or exhaustion. It was calculated. And it was getting worse. The night of June 3, 2023, MIA disappeared. No one had seen her leave, and no one could find any trace of her. Darius had come home that evening, as usual, late and without explanation. But this time, when he entered the bedroom, MIA was gone. Her purse, her phone, and her shoes were left behind, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The bed was untouched, the house eerily silent. What had happened? Where had she gone? The police were called, and the investigation began immediately. Officers combed the house for any clues, but what they found was disturbing. There were blood stains on the carpet, faint but unmistakable. The bedroom, once a place of intimacy, now felt cold and desolate. It was clear something had gone terribly wrong. And Darius, his behavior was odd, too controlled, too practiced. The officers noted his reluctance to answer questions, his vague responses. But there was no evidence to accuse him, yet. Could MIA have left on her own? Had something happened to her? And if so, where was she? The evidence was there, right in front of the officers, but no one was willing to say what they all feared. What had happened to MIA Thompson? It was the evening of June 10, 2023, a warm Saturday night that carried a breeze through the Thompson home. Yet inside, the air felt suffocating. Darius Thompson, the respected pastor, stood in the kitchen, his back turned to his wife, MIA, who sat at the dining table, nervously picking at her food. She had been feeling off for the past few days, dizzy, fatigued, but she attributed it to the high-risk pregnancy and the stress of her failing marriage. She had no idea that her body, already pushed to its limits by the weight of carrying life, was about to bear the burden of something far more sinister. Darius's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, paranoia, fear, and an overwhelming sense of control slipping through his fingers. His affair with Camille had been ongoing for months now, a secret he feared would destroy everything. His position in the church, his wealth, the life he had built, all of it was at risk if MIA found out. He knew that if MIA ever exposed him, It would be the end of his reputation, the end of everything he had worked for. And so, as the days passed and his guilt became a constant weight on his shoulders, he began to plot. The solution was simple: MIA had to disappear. The thought took root and began to fester. He needed her out of the picture. But how? The question gnawed at him until he turned to Camille, who, by now, was aware of the escalating tension between Darius and his wife. Camille had been in his life long enough to understand the stakes. It was clear that MIA was becoming suspicious, and if the affair was exposed, Camille would lose her hold over Darius as well. She had no intention of allowing that to happen. Together, they devised a plan. Camille, a woman with wealth and influence, knew how to hide things in plain sight. She suggested using something that would be nearly impossible to trace: poison. A slow-acting poison, one that would mimic the symptoms of pregnancy complications: fatigue, nausea, dizziness, and leave no obvious signs of foul play. It would look like a tragic, inevitable part of the pregnancy. And MIA, poor MIA, would never suspect a thing. Darius's mind raced as he prepared. He had already started acting as though he cared more, giving MIA extra attention, convincing her that he was committed to her and the pregnancy. He even went as far as to accompany her to the doctor, pretending to be the caring, doting husband. But in reality, he was counting the days, waiting for the perfect moment to execute the plan. He had to move quickly. Camille had already begun to grow impatient with his delays. On June 10th, everything was in place. The couple had spent the evening at home, in what was supposed to be a quiet night in. MIA, exhausted from the pregnancy, had asked Darius to make dinner, something light and simple. It wasn't unusual for him to step in and cook, especially after their long days. But this time, the meal he prepared was different. He had spent hours researching the precise dose of poison needed to make it look like MIA was suffering from nothing more than a difficult pregnancy. He had purchased the poison in small quantities, under the guise of something else, weeks before. It had arrived in discreet packages, never raising suspicion. The meal, a simple chicken casserole, was the perfect vehicle. The poison dissolved easily in the sauce, undetectable to the untrained eye. The dinner was served around 7:30 p.m., a mild evening in June. Darius sat across from MIA, his smile barely masking the storm inside his mind. He watched her eat, the faintest hint of satisfaction creeping into his expression as she took bite after bite, unaware of the danger in front of her. "Are you feeling okay?" Darius asked, his voice low and soothing, almost too comforting. "I don't know," MIA replied, rubbing her temples. "I feel nauseous. Maybe it's just the pregnancy." She paused, her eyes distant. "But, I don't know. Something feels off." Darius nodded sympathetically, masking his inner turmoil. "It's just the hormones." "You're doing great, MIA. It'll pass." By 8:15 p.m., MIA had finished her meal, but her body was already beginning to react. At first, it was subtle, just a slight nausea that worsened as the evening wore on. She excused herself to the bathroom, feeling the sharp pangs of dizziness overtaking her. She staggered back to the bedroom, sitting heavily on the edge of their bed, her hand clutching the side of her stomach. The nausea was intensifying, and she felt an overwhelming sense of fatigue. "I'm so tired," MIA murmured as she lay down, hoping the discomfort would pass. She wasn't aware that the poison was slowly shutting down her body's ability to function, shutting down the systems that had once kept her vibrant. The room around her began to spin. Darius watched from the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest, but his face a mask of calm. He pretended to pace the hallway, as if uncertain of how to handle her discomfort. He needed her to grow weaker, just a little longer. As the minutes ticked by, Mia's condition worsened. Her breathing became shallow, her skin paler with each passing second. She looked up at Darius from the bed, her eyes clouded with confusion and exhaustion. "I don't feel well. I'm going to call the doctor," Darius said, rushing to the phone, but his fingers hesitated over the keypad. He didn't need a doctor. What he needed was for her to die, quietly, quickly, without any suspicion. Mia's body began to betray her, convulsing weakly as her muscles began to stiffen. She gasped for air, clutching her chest, but it was no use. She slumped to the side, her body falling limp. Darius remained perfectly composed. He walked over to the bed, touched her forehead, And then, as if the thought had just occurred to him, calmly dialed 911. "Help! My wife, she's not breathing." His voice was calm, his tone controlled, as though he were calling for a simple inconvenience rather than the death of his spouse. As the paramedics arrived minutes later, Darius stepped aside, maintaining a cold distance. His face was a portrait of grief, but his heart was nothing but stone. The wife he had promised to love and protect was gone. And now, in the shadows, his true nature began to emerge. There was no remorse. There was no guilt. Only the cold certainty that his life, his wealth, his power, all of it, would remain intact. But little did he know, the threads of his carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. The morning of June 11, 2023, was overcast, heavy with rain and an oppressive silence that hung over the Thompson residence. The air felt thick with unanswered questions. Inside the bedroom where Mia's lifeless body had been discovered, the room was now filled with the steady hum of investigative equipment, as the police and forensic team worked tirelessly to piece together the mystery of her death. Detective Tara Williams, the lead investigator, stood by the door of the bedroom, her gaze sharp and focused as she surveyed the scene. A woman of conviction, known for her no-nonsense approach, Detective Williams had already made one thing clear. This was no ordinary death. Mia's sudden collapse didn't add up. Pregnancy complications weren't always fatal, and the circumstances surrounding the event raised more questions than answers. "Start with the basics," Detective Williams muttered to her team. "Blood stains, signs of struggle, and her condition. Let's see what we've got." The forensic team scoured the room, carefully photographing the blood stains on the carpet, the small pool near the bed, which indicated that MIA had likely lost consciousness before hitting the floor. The bed itself, untouched, had no sign of a violent altercation. No broken furniture, no disturbed objects. Everything in its place, except for the body. And that was the first clue that something was amiss. As the team took their samples and catalogued the evidence, Detective Williams moved to the kitchen, her mind already assembling the puzzle pieces. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, no indication of a break-in. It appeared as though the victim had been in her own home the entire time. But then why had MIA died? And who could benefit from her death? It wasn't long before the toxicology reports came in, and they would change the direction of the entire investigation. On June 13, 2023, the preliminary results were clear. MIA had died from poisoning. A slow-acting toxin, one that mimicked the symptoms of pregnancy complications, had been introduced into her system, most likely through her food or drink. The poison was found in the casserole Darius had prepared for dinner, the very meal he had served her the night of her death. The lab results didn't just confirm the cause of death. They also confirmed what Detective Williams had suspected all along. This was no tragic accident. This was murder. But who had the motive? Darius Thompson, the well-respected pastor, now stood at the top of the list. There was the obvious question. Why would a man who had built a life in the church, who was loved by his congregation, turn on his wife? To answer that, the detectives began examining the relationships within the Thompson household, starting with the pastor. They uncovered phone records, long, late-night calls to an unknown number, usually around the time MIA would have been asleep. They began reviewing text messages, and it was one specific message that sent a chill through the entire team. On the evening of June 9, 2023, just one day before Mia's death, Darius had sent a text to Camille, his mistress, that revealed far more than he intended. The message read, "It's almost done. Mia's getting weaker. I'll make sure she doesn't wake up tomorrow. We can finally be together. No one will know." It was a moment of carelessness, one that would become the cornerstone of the entire investigation. Camille, who had so far managed to remain in the shadows, was now firmly tied to the crime. But just how involved was she? And what role had she played in the plot to kill MIA? Detective Williams and her team began to piece together more disturbing details. Camille's testimony was initially shaky, as she tried to deny any involvement. But there were inconsistencies in her story, small contradictions that eventually built a damning case. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood showed Camille entering the Thompson household in the late hours of the night, just after Darius had served dinner. She stayed for less than an hour, but her presence, combined with the timing, made it clear she had been more than just an innocent bystander. The deeper the investigation went, the more the facade began to crack. The neighbors, initially sympathetic, began to raise questions. One neighbor, Mrs. Carter, recalled seeing Darius leave the house the night before Mia's death, his expression tense, his eyes scanning the street nervously. She had thought nothing of it at the time, but in hindsight, her memory of the moment now seemed pivotal. "I saw him around 10:30 p.m., Mrs. Carter recalled during her testimony. "He looked out of sorts, like he was hiding something. It's not like him to be out that late. He's always at church, you know, or with MIA. Her statement seemed innocuous at first, but it planted a seed of doubt. Was it just a coincidence? Or had Darius been ensuring that his wife wouldn't wake up, leaving the house to go meet Camille, to finalize the plan? As the days passed, the evidence continued to mount. Camille's role in the crime became more apparent. The text messages, the timing of her visits, the fact that she had access to the house, all of it pointed toward a conspiracy. But just when it seemed like the case was closing in on Darius and Camille, a new lead emerged. The police were tipped off by an anonymous source, someone claiming to have seen Darius disposing of something in the trash at a local park. When they recovered the bag, it contained several discarded bottles of a substance that resembled the poison used in Mia's death. The tip was anonymous, but the evidence was irrefutable. Now, the noose was tightening. Darius, once the beloved pastor, now faced charges of premeditated murder. His calm demeanor throughout the investigation, his insistence on his innocence, began to unravel in the face of mounting proof. And Camille, who had hoped to remain in the shadows, found herself under investigation for her role in the plot. But questions lingered. Was Darius the mastermind, or was he simply a man driven to desperation by the fear of losing everything? And what of Camille? Did she truly act as a willing accomplice, or had she been manipulated by the pastor's charm and promises? As the pieces fell into place, the investigators knew one thing for certain. This was a case that would haunt them for years to come. The air in the interrogation room was thick with tension. Detective Williams sat across from Darius Thompson, the once esteemed pastor who had built a career upon trust, faith, and the goodwill of his congregation. Now, he sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the table before him. His posture was calm, too calm for someone who had just witnessed the unraveling of his entire life. It was as if he had already accepted the inevitability of what was to come. Behind the one-way glass, the forensic team and other officers waited. The evidence was overwhelming. The blood stains, the toxicology reports, the damning text messages between Darius and Camille. It was all inescapable. Detective Williams had already spoken to Camille, who, under pressure, had begun to crack. She had confessed her role in the crime, but it was clear from the beginning that she was only a pawn in Darius's game. She had been promised a future, wealth, and status, in exchange for her silence and complicity. But now, it was Darius's turn to face the music. The room was silent for a moment, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Detective Williams leaned forward, her voice steady but laden with the weight of truth. "Darius," she began, her gaze unwavering, "we have everything. The texts, the poison, the blood in your bedroom. We know it was you. It wasn't a moment of passion. It was cold, calculated. You murdered your wife." The pastor remained silent, his jaw clenched. His eyes flickered for a split second, as if contemplating something, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think I killed her?" His voice was low, almost disinterested. "She was weak. She couldn't even carry a child. What kind of wife, what kind of woman, keeps failing at something so simple?" Detective Williams paused, letting his words sink in, the disgust building in her chest. "That's not how it happened, Darius. We know you poisoned her. You planned it. You manipulated her. You used her like an object, and when she became too much of a burden, you decided to end it. Because you couldn't afford to lose what you had. The church, the respect, the control." Darius's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising for the first time, but still devoid of any real emotion. "I did what I had to do. I had everything to lose. You think the congregation would have forgiven me if they knew the truth about MIA? About Camille? About my—" He paused, his voice faltering for the briefest moment, as though the weight of his own guilt almost broke through. But then he steadied himself, and the mask returned. "I did what I had to do. I couldn't let her destroy everything. Detective Williams leaned in further, her voice gaining strength. So, you killed your wife because you feared losing your wealth and status. Because your affair was more important than the woman who stood by your side for years? That's what you're saying. Darius remained still. There was no hesitation in his eyes. No shame. Just cold calculation. I didn't kill her out of hate, he said, his voice almost bored now. I killed her because she was a threat. A threat to everything I had worked for. My reputation, my place in the community. MIA was unstable. She couldn't keep herself together. She was too much for me. And Camille, she understood me. She wanted the same things. She wanted to be seen, to have power. And I could give her that. His eyes shifted, and for the first time in hours, there was a flicker of something more. You think I didn't love MIA? I did. But love isn't enough. Not when you're drowning. At that moment, Camille's confession was brought into the room. She entered quietly, her eyes red and swollen, her hands trembling. The moment she stepped into the room, Darius's posture stiffened. His expression tightened, though his eyes didn't betray a hint of remorse. Detective Williams turned to Camille, who could barely meet her gaze. Camille, she began, her voice softer now. You know what happens next. We already have your confession. You knew about the plan. You were complicit. You gave him advice. You told him how to get away with it. Camille nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I was helping him. I thought we were going to be together, and everything would be better. Better? Detective Williams repeated, the disbelief in her voice apparent. You think poisoning a pregnant woman is a way to make things better? You were willing to let an innocent woman die so you could have a man's money, his position, his power. Camille sobbed, clutching her hands together. But there was no stopping the tide of truth now. I didn't think it would go this far. I thought he would just make her leave or something, but when he said he was going to make her sick, I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't think he'd actually do it. I didn't want her dead. I just wanted him to leave her. But he said it was the only way. Detective Williams turned to Darius, who had remained eerily silent throughout Camille's confession. His gaze, however, was no longer calm. There was something wild, almost panicked in his eyes now. But still, he said nothing. You knew she would die, Detective Williams said to Darius, and you went through with it anyway. Why? For Camille? For your affair? Or for something else entirely? Darius finally broke his silence, his voice cold as ice. You think I'm the only one guilty here? You think Camille doesn't deserve to be punished? She's just as responsible as I am. She helped. She was my partner in this. We both wanted the same thing. His confession, now out in the open, was as chilling as the calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the investigation. There was no regret in his voice, no guilt in his eyes. Only a man who had lived in his own twisted reality for far too long. Detective Williams knew, in that moment, that Darius Thompson wasn't a man who had acted in the heat of passion. He wasn't a man driven by love or loss. No, he was a man consumed by his own ambition, his desire for power and wealth, a man willing to sacrifice everything, including his wife's life, for the life he wanted. And as for Camille, well, her role in this tragedy had already been sealed. She had acted out of greed, out of a hunger for status, a woman so blinded by her own desires that she couldn't see the consequences of her actions. Both of them were guilty. Both of them were complicit. But the story didn't end there. It wasn't just about a betrayal between a husband and wife. It wasn't just about love gone wrong. No, this was about the lengths some people would go to, the depths of moral corruption, and the destruction of everything good and sacred for the sake of selfishness and desire. It was a story of how people, when pushed by their own demons, could justify murder in the name of love, or power, or money, whatever it took to keep their world from falling apart. And now, the world was watching, waiting for the truth to be told. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the courtroom was in stark contrast to the heat of the scandal that had rocked the city. The once proud pastor, Darius Thompson, now stood at the center of it all, facing the consequences of his horrific actions. The gallery was filled with reporters, onlookers, and a handful of church members who had once called him a leader, a man of faith. Their faces, once filled with admiration, now held a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and confusion. The trial had begun just weeks after the confessions of Darius and Camille. The evidence had been damning. The toxicology reports, the blood stains in the bedroom, the text messages between the pastor and his mistress. All of it pointed to one inescapable truth. Darius Thompson had murdered his wife, MIA, for his own selfish gain. But Camille, the mistress, had also been charged. She had willingly aided and abetted the crime. And in the eyes of the law, her greed was just as culpable as Darius's betrayal. The court proceedings were lengthy, filled with emotional testimony and raw moments. Mia's family spoke of their grief, of the young life that had been lost, of the future that was stolen away from her and her unborn child. Their pain was palpable, their anger directed squarely at Darius, the man who had vowed to protect his wife in front of God and his congregation. The prosecution laid out its case, detailing the calculated nature of the crime, showing how Darius had poisoned MIA over the course of several days, making her illness seem like a pregnancy complication. It was chilling to hear how he had watched her deteriorate, feigning concern while planning her death. But it was Camille, too, who became the focal point of the trial. She had insisted that her role in the crime was one of love, her desire to be with Darius, to secure a future with him. But the prosecution painted a different picture. Camille had been an opportunist, driven by wealth and status, willing to manipulate a vulnerable man and push him to murder for the sake of her own desires. Darius, however, remained cold throughout the trial, offering no remorse. His defense was centered around his fear of losing everything: the wealth, the status, the respect. He had built his life on these foundations, and in his twisted mind, MIA had become a threat. He insisted that he had acted out of necessity, that he had done what was required to protect his future. The defense painted him as a man caught in a desperate situation, pushed to the edge by the failures of his marriage, by his affair, and by the weight of the pressure that came with being a pastor. But the jury was unmoved. After several weeks of testimony, deliberations, and closing arguments, the verdict was delivered. Darius Thompson was found guilty of first-degree murder, and Camille was convicted of accessory to murder. The judge sentenced Darius to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Camille received a lesser sentence, though it was clear that she, too, would face years behind bars for her role in the crime. As Darius was led out of the courtroom, his expression remained unchanged: no remorse, no regret. His life, the life he had carefully constructed around lies, deceit, and power, had crumbled in an instant. Camille, too, was escorted away, her head lowered, her hands shackled. In the end, neither of them would ever see the freedom they once took for granted. But the true devastation was left to the community. The members of the church, who had once held Darius in the highest regard, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered faith. They had trusted him with their spiritual well-being, with their families, with their lives. And now, they were forced to reckon with the reality that the man they had admired had been a monster hiding in plain sight. The scandal reverberated throughout the congregation, leaving many disillusioned and questioning everything they had believed in. The once thriving church now saw a steady decline in attendance, as the moral foundation that Darius had built had crumbled beneath the weight of his betrayal. Church leaders were quick to distance themselves from the scandal, offering prayers for the healing of the community. But many of the faithful were left wondering how they had been so blind, so willing to put their trust in a man who had led them into darkness. Could they ever rebuild their faith after such a monumental breach of trust? The families of MIA and her unborn child, left to mourn their loss, sought solace in the memories of a woman who had been robbed of her life far too soon. The questions lingered. Why had it come to this? Was there ever a way to stop the chain of events that had led to Mia's death? Could anyone have seen the signs, prevented the betrayal, or stopped the cold, calculated murder that had unfolded within the walls of a once hopeful home? And so, the community struggled with its own sense of guilt and confusion. Could Darius have been saved? Could the affair have been avoided? Was it inevitable that his ambition, his hunger for power, and his manipulation of those around him would eventually lead to something so horrific? The answers were elusive. Some believed that the crime could have been prevented if Darius had sought help, if he had confided in someone, if he had chosen a different path. But others wondered if the affair had simply been part of a larger story, one that had already been set in motion long before the poison was slipped into Mia's food. As the years went on, the church attempted to recover, though it was never the same. Many left, unable to forgive Darius for his betrayal. Some, however, stayed behind, still holding on to the lessons they had learned before the scandal shattered their world. They prayed for forgiveness, for healing, and for the strength to rebuild their lives. But even as the community moved forward, the shadows of the past still lingered. Darius's trial had been a public spectacle, but behind closed doors, there were still lingering questions. What drove a man to betray not just his wife, but the community that trusted him? Was it ambition, greed, or something deeper, something darker within his soul? As for Camille, her story was far from over. She had been sentenced, but the true extent of her involvement remained a subject of speculation. How much had she known? How much had she manipulated Darius? And how much had he manipulated her? Was she simply a victim of circumstance, or had she played a larger role in the tragedy than anyone could have imagined? The affair may have been over, but questions lingered. The scars from Darius and Camille's actions would take years, if not generations, to heal. And so, as the final gavel fell, the story of Darius Thompson and his wife Mia's untimely death ended with a grim sense of finality. But even now, the haunting echoes of their choices continue to reverberate. There were no simple answers, no easy resolutions. Only the tragic reminder that sometimes the deepest betrayals come from the places we least expect: our homes, our hearts, and the people we trust the most. What drives a man to destroy everything he has built? Is it the fear of losing everything, or the belief that he has already lost it all? And in the end, who is truly to blame for the tragedies we cannot undo? The case of Darius Thompson and Mia's tragic death is over, but the lingering questions remain. As the final chapters of this dark story are written, we are left to reflect on the complexity of human nature, the forces that push ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. The motivations are as varied as the individuals involved. For Darius, it was a potent cocktail of fear, greed, and selfish ambition, a desperate attempt to preserve a life that was built on lies, a fragile tower of power that collapsed under its own weight. For Camille, the Mistress, it was a pursuit of wealth and status, her own desires feeding into a larger, darker plan. What is it that drives a person, a husband, a father-to-be, to so completely betray those they love? The answer may never be fully understood, but perhaps we can begin to peel back the layers. Was Darius simply the product of a toxic environment, a man raised in the shadow of power and control? Or was he driven by something more internal, by a moral decay that had long been festering, hidden beneath the surface of his role as a man of faith? Human nature is a study in contradictions. We are capable of great love, but also of terrible cruelty. We build lives based on trust and faith, but sometimes the very foundations we depend on can betray us when we are least expecting it. The pastor who swore to protect his wife from harm became the one who caused it. The mistress, who appeared to be a friend, became the accomplice in a life-ending betrayal. And the community, which placed its trust in a man of God, was left broken, disillusioned, and questioning the very fabric of their beliefs. In the end, this story is more than just about betrayal or murder. It is a reminder of the fragile nature of the human psyche, how easily it can be manipulated, how fear can drive even the most rational person to make unthinkable choices, how ambition can blind us to the true cost of our actions, how guilt can distort our sense of right and wrong. These are the forces that shape us, the invisible threads that weave through our lives, often without our conscious awareness. As you reflect on the events that led to Mia's death and the unraveling of Darius and Camille's carefully constructed lives, take a moment to consider the moral dilemmas at play. Could this tragedy have been avoided? Was there a point, somewhere along the way, when a different choice could have spared a life? Did Darius ever truly believe in his own righteousness? Or was he simply justifying the inevitable, believing that he was trapped in a life he couldn't escape? And what of Camille? Was she a victim of circumstance, or did she willfully participate in the destruction of another woman's life? There are no easy answers. But what remains clear is that this case is a microcosm of the complexities that reside within all of us. We are all capable of great darkness, just as we are capable of great light. And it is often our choices, our actions, that define us, whether we want them to or not. The consequences of Darius Thompson's actions are felt far beyond the cold walls of the courtroom. Mia's family, her community, and even the church will never fully recover from the ripples caused by her untimely death. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most chilling aspect of this entire story. The fact that one person's choices can alter the course of many lives, and that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who will hurt us the deepest. As we leave this tale of tragedy and loss behind, ask yourself, what drives a person to such extremes? And as you ponder that question, remember this: the most dangerous lies we tell are often the ones we tell ourselves. The affair may have ended, but the consequences of that betrayal will linger, haunting everyone involved for years to come. And as for the community, it must now rebuild from the ashes of what was once a place of refuge and trust. Can they ever heal? Can they ever truly forgive? Perhaps that is the ultimate question. And like the story of Darius, Mia, and Camille, the answer may remain hidden, forever a part of the darkness that now surrounds them.